Okay, so I love conference topics that challenge me and take my thinking along unexpected paths. And I've called my talk The Mystery and Adventure of Bridge Building. When I first heard the topic of this conference, building bridges, not walls, my thoughts immediately went to Martin Buber and that hyphen, that little line between the I and thou. And then I thought about the wonder of the therapeutic relationship which we and clients can co-create. And then all the other bridges that there are within the therapy setting, the bridge between the known and the unknown, between past, present, future, and the bridges that go to create us. I'm not a linear thinker. And I used to find my lateral and meandering thinking frustrating until I discovered the potential that lay within it. And as I wrote this, it occurred to me that this meandering mode of reflecting, going like this, is in itself a form of crossing bridges into seemingly totally unrelated lands. Don't ask me to tell a story. I go like that. But lead me down other paths, which in turn lead me to other worlds. Indeed, I've come to realize that because of my family's history, I've had to start bridging very early in my life and continue to do it throughout my life, in different areas of my life, bridging and integrating. It has affected my way of being, my way of thinking, of relating. It has helped create my Weltanschauung, my worldview. Of course, we've all had to create bridges in our lives. For a start, we're all born of a mother and a father, even if we don't know one or both of them. And our very existence bridges and integrates two family lines. However, some people feel a greater need or a greater curiosity to create bridges and seek change or adventure, whereas others may be paralyzed either by the fear of falling beneath in the abyss or obstacle to be overcome, or as they experience what lies on the other side as too anxiety-provoking to attempt to cross there. Have you ever looked at a bridge and wondered about the engineering feat required to build it, especially the bit in the middle? With some bridges, it is their beauty that I find awe-inspiring. I love these slender lines, and you've got some beautiful bridges here that bridge huge distances. With others, as it is the spirit that animates their constructions, which I find so extraordinary. And you know those Chinese paintings where you see mountains and these huge gaps and these rickety little bridges on top, or photographs of bridges in the Andes, and the courage it must take to cross them. And bridge building can be a dangerous occupation. When they built the bridge between mainland France and the island of Oléron in 1966, they saw fit to put a notice to say that no worker had been killed while building the bridge. And it still stands there as a memento mori for bridge builders. Phenomenologically speaking, a bridge strides over a gap or obstacle and enables us to cross from one side of that obstacle to the other. The bridge itself clearly needs to be sufficiently solid for its intended use, whether a single person or a stream of cars or a train. But it also needs to have a sufficiently solid base on either side on which to rest. So too in therapy. So I would like to look briefly at theory bridges between modalities, before moving on to some of the difficulties encountered in building bridges in the counseling room, and then turning to the bridges that have gone to create us as therapists. And I'm hoping to end with an experiential exercise. So psychotherapeutic theory bridges. Theory bridges span the gaps of various widths that exist between modalities. For modalities, even when they're not islands unto themselves, are usually more than just cognitive theories. They often constitute systems of beliefs which carry the emotional charge of personal investment, belonging, and loyalty, as well as sometimes complex interpersonal dynamics. Many of us will refer to our modality as our home, for it grounds our worldview. It is partly that emotional charge, together with differences in underpinning premises and methods, which dictate the gap that separates modalities and affects bridging. It is that emotional charge that turns modalities, for some therapists, into fiercely defended islands or into homes too cozy or scary to leave. How we travel along these bridges will vary from therapist to therapist. Some begin their journey by traveling from modality to modality until they find one to their liking. Some may choose to spend time living with a worldview that each therapeutic modality opens, feeling at home in each. Some, myself included, having discovered a theory which they like, make it their principal base, and from that solid base, journey into different modalities, returning home enriched by what they have learned elsewhere, and integrating these new learnings into their basic theory. Others, having started in one particular modality, do not feel the need to look anywhere else, preferring to deepen their study of it. There are those, however, who do not dare to cross the bridge into another theoretical modality for fear of feeling out of their comfort zone, lost or de-skilled. Or else they may believe that the theory which they have espoused is so superior in every other way to any others that they refuse to explore, even briefly, a different theoretical worldview, or do so from a position of such superiority that they cannot learn anything. And I know people from all of these different ways of doing it. And so I wonder, how do you see your own theoretical journey as existential therapists? You may be at the very beginning and following in the footsteps of someone guiding your way, someone who may or may not themselves have created various bridges for you to cross. Or you may have years of experience as an existential therapist. If so, do you prefer to explore the richness that this modality has to offer? Or have you also crossed bridges into other modalities? And if so, how have you done it? And do you feel it has affected you personally and professionally? Now, I don't have time to talk about my own journey. All I will say is that it's Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty that for me provided the bridges to cross into sensory motor psychotherapy and systemic constellations. So with Claire, I was in Emily's very first group at the New School of Psychotherapy and Counseling almost 28 years ago. And then 12 years ago, I crossed the bridge into sensory motor psychotherapy, which is a body-focused trauma therapy, and systemic constellations, and have brought back the insights of that into existential therapy. And my book, The Heart of Therapy, gives concrete examples of that. So I'll skip all this. I would now like to turn to the most important bridge in the therapeutic space, that is a therapeutic relationship. And isn't it amazing that it's taken decades for people to realize that, for research to show that its importance. So the therapeutic relationship, or how may we build a bridge between us? Where on the bridge shall we two meet? I once had a tutor who was highly proficient in 8 or 10 modalities. She was even, she told us, the first chaos therapist. This struck me at the time as a theoretically incompatible mishmash, and I wondered how she could possibly integrate them. And I have no idea how it manifested itself in the therapeutic space with clients. But I can see what she was able to pass on to me as her student. It first happened through a co-created gesture of giving and receiving. Every week she would arrive with a tiny bunch, quite a big lady, would arrive with a tiny bunch of flowers, and we would rush to find somewhere to put them. And I thought, well, either it's sort of sentimental or fake, or it's meant in good faith. And so I thought I would believe that it was done in good faith. And in the third week, I brought a little tiny vase to receive her flowers. And in this act of giving and my act of receiving, and I did it week after week, I felt that something was passed on. And I'm aware that as I'm doing this movement, it is this sort of bridge movement. The other something that was passed on happened through a question she asked me. I mentioned in class a particular client who was in a very difficult place, and I wasn't sure whether my way of responding to her was sufficient or right. The tutor asked me, "How is her flame burning?" And the following week, she asked me whether my client's flame was still burning and how. Over the years, I've had occasion to ask myself and my supervisees this question: is a client's flame still burning? Is it just barely there? And if so, how can it be protected? What does it need to keep going? I don't know what led this tutor to study so many modalities in some depth, nor do I know whether she managed to truly integrate them in any way. But there must have been some sort of dialogue within herself, maybe incidental to all her learning, from which she could bring flowers and speak this metaphor in a way that was very meaningful to me. And this metaphor has been a gift to me, and I too have managed to pass it on. And as I sat down to think and write about those clients with whom building a therapeutic relationship has been fraught with difficulties, this image of a client's flame again came to mind, and I could feel myself cupping my hands around the flame to protect it. And as I cupped my hands, a few clients immediately came to mind. Clients about whom I sensed a deep fragility, clients whose flame burned very low. Not because they were cancer patients, because most of my patients at the time were clients were cancer patients, nor because they were fragile looking or suicidal. They were actually survivors. They had endured a great deal and showed much resilience in life. Barnett was one such client, a real survivor, but one in whom I sense a sort of interpersonal fragility, a need for a very cautious and gentle approach from me. And she walked cautiously into my counseling room and sat down opposite me. I felt the need to check out the distance between our chairs. Now, this is a typical sensory motor routine thing that you're supposed to do, but I don't do it routinely. I only know, and I don't know whether you ever do it, but when I sense the need to do it, I often find it enlightening. While for most people, it seems to be a question of boundaries where they feel comfortable or unsafe or invaded, etc. I've occasionally encountered clients for whom the very freedom of being asked to choose anything is hugely anxiety-provoking. To be asked to move your chair closer or further is incredibly anxiety-provoking and terrifying, for never as children were they allowed to want anything, and they have carried on through life denying themselves any wishes and desires. But for some of the interpersonally fragile clients I was talking about, it was a threat of closeness that was palpable. Bernadette silently pushed her chair backwards as far as it would go, and lately told me that if it had been at all possible, she would have sat at the end of a very, very long corridor. My first session with Bernadette began with a long silence. Therapists are often taught not to interrupt silence. I personally believe it's really worth checking that the client is happy remaining silent. Silence may be a time for a client where words are not required, a moment of stillness with themselves, in the attentive, caring presence of another person, the therapist. In that silence, there is a being with. The client feels met, accompanied, and held. The very silence could be said to be a bridge upon which we both meet. But silence can also be a time where the situation feels so unsafe or confusing or anxiety-provoking, the words can't order themselves into sentences. or else words do not feel appropriate for the hugeness of what is to be said, too difficult to utter. Instead of a bridge, the silence stands as a gaping chasm between us. So I usually offer some opening. I might ask them to sign with their head whether they're all right in their silence. And if they sign that they're not, I'll ask whether what they have to say is very difficult, or else I might ask what's going on inside them right now. For in such silences, a client often feels very alone, abandoned on the distant shore. And my questions, spaced out in time, offer a bridge over which they can take a few steps so that we may meet. To leave them to sit with their anxiety, which may sound very existential, is to my mind artificial and risks being power imbued. Sorry, I'll just see how I am with time. Bernadette and I managed to form a very strong therapeutic relationship over time. In her history, as well as the other interpersonal fragile clients I can think of, I don't really like that expression, but I can't think of a better one. There was so much neglect. She was one of a number of clients I've worked with who cannot remember ever being touched as children, except to be beaten, abused, or for some functional purpose, and who carried this aversion to touch throughout their lives. So as a mother, she too had great trouble touching her children, being touched by them, although they were her whole world. Yet she had such a yearning for connection. And I shall always remember how at our last session, she put her hands out, and as I turned my palms out to receive them, she took a step back and put the tips of her fingers onto my palms. And it was, and I feel that I can see the bridge like that we co-created and on which we were able to meet partway in a mutual act of giving and receiving. Fragility would hardly come to mind in relation to Mavis. Tough as old boots might be more appropriate. And yet she displayed a similar mistrust to Bernadette's, a similar lack of intimacy in her life and yearning for connection, and had had an equally neglectful childhood. But softness and quietness were not for her. Hers, what we call in English, the effing and blinding approach to interpersonal relations. Like when I went to see the fucking doctors, you know, that... which left her too very isolated. And I obviously couldn't respond in kind by swearing, but nor did I feel I could respond with gentleness and softly as I would have done with Bernadette. I felt I needed to meet her at a sort of similar level of energy, but of course devoid of anger and rage, which hers carried. And in some way that energy was bridge building. We did manage to create a good therapeutic relationship, but it turned out not to be sufficiently strong to carry her over my summer break. I describe in The Heart of Therapy that I made the mistake of agreeing to bring back a shell for her from my summer holidays without first exploring what would happen if I were to forget to do so. I didn't forget the shell, but she'd had too many broken promises in her life to risk it. I wondered whether she'd burnt the bridge or just blocked its entrance temporarily, so I kept the shell, but she didn't return. I'm just looking for, maybe skip this example. Oh, sorry. No, I'll do this one. In the following example, I feel another type of bridge was created, and I wonder what you make of it. And you may have heard me mention it before because it really struck me at the time. My client was telling me how she would sit at home feeling numb, unable to cry the loss of her grandmother. And as she spoke, I could feel my guts really wrenching like that. Like, you know, when you twist dry out a floor cloth or something. And the following session, she said that she'd come the following week, she said she went straight home from our session into the bathroom and felt this terrible, painful wrenching of her guts. And then she cried her guts out. Would you see this as pure coincidence? And if not, what had happened? I have no answer to that, other than I do believe that something happened between us. I call it mesopathy, the feeling in the middle, something that facilitated her shift out of numbness and enabled her to cry. And was that something not a bridge? Yeah. There is another group of clients with whom bridge building can be particularly difficult. And I'm thinking of those clients whose embodied messages learnt in childhood, together with any other so-called truths gleaned along the way, have created walls around them and impacted their capacity to build bridges. Such clients may have picked up messages such as I'm useless, I'm sinful, I'm boring, who'd be interested in me, leave me alone. And these internalized messages are likely to play themselves out in the counseling room. Rather the security of isolation than the risk of contact. And James is one such client. I told him about the topic of this conference and asked him what he made of it. He began to speak about some basic bridges of genuine communication which were absent in his life and what it would mean to him to have such bridges, let alone to step onto one. And then as we turned to the bridge between us and how he felt we two meet on it, he said, sometimes I feel you need to come very close to my end as you encourage me to step onto the bridge, while at other times I can feel you gently inviting me further over, and I feel able to walk on the bridge towards you. And then there are times where I just shut down. And this felt a poignant description of our therapeutic relationship. I'm going to, and I'll mention dissociation, but I don't have time to talk about it and the different parts and how we meet clients. Sometimes we think we're talking to the adult and suddenly it's like having a 13-year-old or a 7-year-old in front of us. And that is a fact, a sort of bridge, sort of crossing bridges in time. And obviously the time bridges are very important to therapeutic relationship, the ones that the clients talk about when they talk about their past and the future and how the past impacts on the future and vice versa and on the present. And they're those bridges which we therapists help to make explicit and articulate, as when a client is talking about a row he had with his partner and then and he feels terribly criticized, although the partner said, no, not at all. And then we might say, is there anything familiar in in those feelings? Is there, oh, yes, and that's, of course, the past being with a hypercritical parent or a boss. And we may say, 5-10 years from now, what would you like to see in your life? Or how would you like to see this point in time? So we may make bridges, time bridges, explicitly. So in this brief glance at my work with clients, I've sought to highlight certain bridges in the therapeutic space. Bridges to fragile or heavily guarded shores, bridges over the distance between us, bridges over time, bridges over silence, and the more elusive bridge of being with. And still thinking of bridge construction, I wonder, how can a bridge be built when the ground on the other side is so fragile, or in the case of my client Mavis, when there is such a thin, tough crust above it? And I think if there is little support on the client side, it has to be really solid on my side. I need to feel particularly grounded and centered. And I believe that interpersonally fragile clients need to feel this centeredness of mine. For of course, the difficulty with creating a bridge does not simply rest with what's happening on the client's shore. The ground on our shore and our own bridge building capacities are even more crucial. True clients may challenge those capacities when they're being offensive, dangerous, or have committed some terrible acts for which it's very difficult to feel compassion. But most of our trigger buttons result from our own baggage. Baggage which risks creating areas of instability, sinkholes, rigid boundaries, and walls on our own shore unsuitable for bridge building, which takes us into the third part. So the therapist as created through bridges. So far I've focused on creating bridges and not developed my other point of how we as therapists are also created through bridges and bridging. In my abstract, because I didn't know what I was going to talk about, because it was just an abstract, I thought of playing with the idea of being created by bridges And one playful thought that came to mind was clothes. So I'm going to illustrate the idea of being created through bridges by starting with something that might appear very trivial before moving from that seeming triviality to the other extreme of the continuum. What do your clothes mean to you? How do you choose what you wear with clients? Have you ever thought about the possible impact on your clients of how you dress? There was a time when I was concerned that my very vitality, my very out there-ness in the world might in some way be too much for my clients, and I should tone down the way I dress. And sometimes I find myself tuning in to a particular client I have that day. And I used to feel bad about it. I was thinking, why am I tuning in to this client that I'm seeing later today when I'm seeing a whole lot of other clients? I remember one particular client with whom not infrequently, we'd find ourselves arriving wearing the same color scheme. Even on 3 occasions, we wore the same scarf. And I have a huge collection of scarves, so it was very surprising. She was a client who'd been rejected in a very fundamental way, and who in the course of her life had had to surround herself with thick protective walls. 15, oh good. And I find it interesting that we should have connected in that particular way. We often speak of putting ourselves in another person's shoes. Have you ever explored the embodied sense of wearing another person's trousers? I could have written a whole paper about these trousers, but I didn't. So these trousers were given to me by one of my daughters-in-law after she and her sisters had sorted out their late mother's clothes. So you can see how much there is to explore in that one gesture of offering me, her mother-in-law, who's still alive, something that was quite intimate to her own mother, who's now dead. And also the various possible ways it opened for me to receive those gifts, accept them, make them or not my own, and wear them when, how often. I wear them very differently to her mother and made their style my own. And for a while, I had the strong sense that when I wore her clothes to see our joint grandchildren, I was bringing with me something that belonged to their other dead grandmother. And I was, if you want, building a bridge, a form of bridge between myself and them and her. It's only much later, when I started looking to buy trousers for myself in the looser style to which she'd unwittingly introduced me, that I realized that something had changed in me. For I felt myself different in what had been her trousers. They brought out a more creative side of myself that was not usually to the fore, and that came with a different posture, a different sense of freedom and ease, a different emotion, subtly so. And it is something which I feel I brought to my clients. And I wonder whether, likewise, there are seemingly trivial areas of your life in which others have built bridges to you that have brought about significant change for yourself, which in turn may have affected your work with clients. I would now like to move to the other end of the continuum from the apparent triviality of clothes. How often has the topic of war entered your counselling room? And I don't mean only the recent wars that are raging at the borders of Europe. I mean the 2 world wars, wars of independence, and conflicts that have involved fighting within one complex, multi-ethnic or multicultural land, as in Northern Ireland, in the Baltic Wars, in parts of the old Soviet Union, and here too in Turkey. I feel I'm breaking a certain taboo in mentioning this, and yet I believe I would be in a bad faith if I didn't do so, as I believe it is of vital importance. And by vital, I just don't mean just really important. I mean important, crucial for our clients' sense of vitality and identity. We just have to look at what's been going on in Crimea or in the Middle East, in Crimea for the past 10 years. Whichever side is the official victor, how many generations is this conflict going to mark? Won't that still need to be explored in 10, 20, 50, 80 years' time? In systemic constellations, which I mentioned earlier, war, famine, a country's history, whether the partition of Ireland, Cyprus, Germany, India, colonialism, the Holocaust, communism, are very commonly represented in a constellation and may have a crucial role within it. And importantly, in constellations, it's not a matter of right or wrong. Rather, it's a premise that persecutor and persecuted, victor and vanquished belong in the same system. And that one side, therefore, just as much as the other, needs to do some bridging for themselves of the gap between them. Actually, I'm going to repeat this premise because I think it is just so vitally important. Persecutor and persecuted, victor and vanquished belong in the same system, and therefore one side, just as much as the other, needs a bridging of the gap between them. I think that colonialism and its impact have now finally begun to enter the therapeutic space, but why not past wars? Sorry, how long do I have? Sorry? 12. I think I'm going to skip a bit and then I would like to do experiential thing. And yes, and I'm not just talking about people that it will affect people of the Second World War, it will affect people of my generation who were born post-war. I mean, even people whose grandparents were so depressed and or angry and etc. And then you find out they were stretcher bearers or they'd seen their best friends decapitated or whatever. Or children of grandchildren of Nazis whose mothers, aunts, grandmothers were raped as they fled from East Germany to West Germany. And how many of you, without maybe less dramatically, not talking of war, but for some of you it might be just as dramatic, how many of you are living in the place in which you were born and grew up? And if so, is that where your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were born? Speaking for myself, I was born in the UK, but my formative years were spent in France. While my parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were born in 6 different countries, indeed, one of my great-grandfathers was born here in Istanbul. So 7 countries between us, and so many stories and cultures, which therefore went to make me. As therapists, we know that it's important we bracket our beliefs and worldview and that we disentangle our feelings and experiences from those of our clients. But how are we to disentangle them if we're not clear about them? How can we bracket something of which we're only vaguely aware? You may think that histories, beliefs, and emotions that sit on the edge of awareness are as good as bracketed, as they are out of sight and out of mind. Yet that is where the danger lurks. For not only can they still be impactful in a relationship, they can play a major role within it and wreak havoc. When I think of how many bridges I've had to create and journey across, and how many ancestral stories I've had to integrate to become me, these are all part and parcels of the I that I am as therapist. However, and that's the most important, I need to be mindful of the part they risk playing in the therapeutic space. So if I've left the importance of bridges that create us for last, it's because I wish to highlight their role in our ability to be grounded, centered and present and compassionate as we sit with clients. For it is in that steady place that the therapeutic bridge can be solidly built. So unfortunately, I don't have time to do anything experiential. And I think, no, because it's how many minutes? Just 5. Sorry? 8 minutes. Should we give it a try? Right, and you can ask me questions in the break if you want, in coffee, or... Sorry? Oh, so it's better to have just questions now, you mean? Yeah, okay. All right. So, do you have any questions? Mm?
Thank you for that. You mentioned the perpetrator and the victims are part of the same system. May I trouble you to elaborate a couple of examples of the systems in place?
No, that it belongs, you can't have a persecutor without a persecutor and vice versa. And that you can't, well, it goes back also to what Amy was saying earlier. One can't just, they go together. You can't just say, there has to be a movement from both sides. The other side has to be understood and their viewpoint understood and accepted at some level, and they're part of how we are. It's a part of the solution. There is no solution without it. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have questions for Claire? We couldn't.
Coffee
right.
break. It's a tea break, isn't it?
Apple. Okay. Would you like to? Sure.
Hello. Thank you for both of you. So my question is, I was wondering in your work with new mothers, whether, or like to what extent had you come across mothers talking about or referring to their own mothers during that phase of transition? I wonder whether it was more intense in a way, or yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I didn't have time to mention it really, but yeah, I think that part of when I was talking about how our relationships change, how mothers' relationships change, you suddenly, as a mother, get transported back into your own childhood. So a lot of clients talk about how they start seeing their mothers in different ways. They start maybe understanding their mothers, you know, maybe they were a bit critical before, and then they suddenly start to think, oh, well, this is, you know, I sort of understand what it might have been like for them now. So there might be a new understanding. But I think also sometimes it works the other way as well. So I think it can be really difficult if there isn't a good relationship between the new mum and her mother. You know, that can then feel very, very difficult. Obviously, if there's been, you know, they've lost their mother as well. So yes, I think this is a kind of, I mean, Simone de Beauvoir talks about this kind of moving up the ladder, generational ladder. And I kind of feel like there's a sort of like a movement back and forth almost, because you're sort of, you move up, but then you also move back in time into your own experience and re-examine that relationship that you have with your mother. And then I guess part of that is you then decide whether you want to be like your mother or not, or sometimes you don't even decide and you suddenly realize that some of the words that you're speaking are actually the things that have been told to you. So I'm not sure whether that's answered your question, but yeah.
But then can I add something to, so I've got 3 chapters in my book on mothering, sort of phenomenology of mothering and some case studies. But also the experiential thing I wanted to do would have involved the bridging the mother, having a look at interpersonal transgenerational stuff. So looking at ancestors on both sides and how we bridge them. And that also obviously involves mothering. Yeah.